Here is a question that most Australian drivers have never seriously asked themselves, even though the answer affects every single journey they make. When was the last time you thought about what is actually sitting between your car and the road? Not the car itself, not the engine or the brakes or the suspension. The 4 contact patches, each one roughly the size of a human hand, that are the only thing connecting 2 tons of moving metal to the surface beneath it. The 4 pieces of rubber that determine whether you stop in time when the car in front of you brakes suddenly on a wet highway, whether you maintain control when you hit a pothole at speed on a country road, whether you get home safely or you do not. Most Australians choose their tyres the way they choose their electricity provider. They leave it until the last possible moment. They pick whatever seems reasonably priced from whoever is available, and they do not think about it again until the next time something forces them to. And the tyre industry, which makes billions of dollars every year from exactly that kind of inattentive purchasing, is perfectly happy with that arrangement. But here is what that inattentive purchasing is actually costing you. Not just in money, though the cost difference between making a good tyre decision and a bad one over the life of a set of tyres is more significant than most people realize. In safety, in real, measurable, the difference between stopping in time and not safety. On Australian roads specifically, roads that are among the most demanding and most varied in the world, that go from smooth urban motorway to corrugated outback track within the same day's driving, that are wet and freezing in Melbourne in July and scorching and sun-damaged in Darwin all year round. So we did something that nobody in the Australian tyre market seems to have done in a straightforward and honest way. We took 3 of the most commonly purchased tyre brands in this country, Bridgestone, Michelin, and Kumho, and we compared them properly. Not on a controlled European test track with optimal conditions, on Australian roads, in Australian conditions, with Australian drivers who use their vehicles the way Australian drivers actually use them. And there is a clear winner. Let us get into how we got there. Why these 3 brands? Before we get to the results, it is worth explaining why we chose Bridgestone, Michelin, and Kumho specifically, because the comparison is only useful if the brands being compared are genuinely representative of the choices that Australian tyre buyers are actually making. Bridgestone is the most straightforward inclusion. It is the best-selling tyre brand in Australia by a considerable margin. It has been a fixture on Australian roads for decades, and it has built its market position on a combination of genuine engineering quality and the kind of sustained marketing investment that embeds a brand name in the minds of consumers so deeply that it becomes the default answer to the question of what tyres to buy. If you have bought tyres in Australia in the past 10 years without doing significant research first, there is a reasonable chance you bought Bridgestones because they were what the tyre shop recommended and you had no strong reason to argue. Michelin is the premium European benchmark, the brand that tyre enthusiasts and automotive journalists consistently cite as the gold standard for road tyre performance, that commands a significant price premium over its competitors, and that justifies that premium with some of the most sophisticated tyre engineering in the industry. Michelin is what you buy when you have done your research and concluded that the best is worth paying for. Whether that conclusion is justified in the specific context of Australian roads is exactly the kind of question this comparison is designed to answer. Kumho is the inclusion that will make some readers slightly uncomfortable, because Kumho sits at the budget end of the market and carries the associations that budget products always carry. The assumption that lower price means lower quality, and that choosing Kumho over Bridgestone or Michelin is a false economy that will cost you more in safety and longevity than you saved at the point of purchase. That assumption deserves to be tested rather than accepted, and testing it is one of the most useful things this comparison can do for Australian tyre buyers. The testing conditions. Why Australian roads change everything. The problem with most tyre comparisons that Australian consumers encounter is that they are conducted in European conditions and then presented as if the results are universally applicable. European test tracks, European road surfaces, European weather patterns. And European roads are genuinely different from Australian roads in ways that matter enormously for tyre performance. Australian roads are more varied in surface quality than almost any road network in the developed world. The difference between a freshly resurfaced suburban arterial in Sydney and a regional highway in outback Queensland that has been sun-damaged, potholed, and repaired in patches over decades is a difference that European tyre testing simply does not account for. Australian temperatures are more extreme at the hot end of the spectrum than anything a European test program routinely models. And the specific hazards of Australian driving, kangaroos, debris from road trains, the sudden transition from sealed to unsealed surface that catches rural drivers out, create performance demands that are genuinely different from what European testing environments simulate. Our testing covered 5 specific conditions that we identified as the most relevant to the Australian driving experience. Urban and suburban driving on mixed surface quality roads, representing the daily commute experience of the majority of Australian drivers. Highway driving at sustained speeds on the kind of long-distance routes that Australians cover in volumes that would be unusual in most European countries. Wet weather performance on both urban streets and rural roads. We tested in Melbourne in winter, which provided conditions that were consistently and usefully miserable. Heat performance, specifically how each tyre handled sustained exposure to high temperatures in Queensland conditions, where road surface temperatures can reach levels that genuinely stress tyre compounds in ways that European testing does not replicate. And light off-road performance, acknowledging that a significant proportion of Australian private vehicle use involves at least some unsealed road driving. Bridgestone, the incumbent under examination. Bridgestone's most relevant offering for the Australian passenger car and SUV market, the Turanza and Dula ranges, depending on vehicle type, performed in a way that was entirely consistent with its market position. Which is to say, competently, reliably, and without ever doing anything that would give a driver either serious concern or serious excitement. On urban and suburban roads, the Bridgestone was exactly what its reputation promises: quiet, comfortable, predictable. The kind of tyre that disappears beneath you in daily driving, which is precisely what most daily drivers want from a tyre. Wet weather performance was solid. Braking distances on wet urban surfaces were within an acceptable range, and the tyre handled standing water without producing the kind of anxiety-inducing aquaplaning response that would be cause for genuine concern. Where the Bridgestone began to show limitations was in the more demanding elements of our testing program. In sustained high-temperature conditions, the tyre's performance characteristics shifted in ways that were measurable, not dramatically or dangerously, but noticeably. Braking distances increased slightly as the tyre reached elevated operating temperatures, and the steering response became marginally less precise in a way that experienced drivers would detect, even if they could not immediately attribute it to tyre behavior. On rough and degraded road surfaces, the Bridgestone was adequate rather than impressive, absorbing minor surface irregularities well, but transmitting larger impacts to the chassis in a way that was less controlled than we had hoped. The overall Bridgestone picture is one of a tyre that thoroughly deserves its market-leading position for the majority of Australian drivers in the majority of Australian driving conditions. It is not the most exciting product in this comparison, but it is the most consistent, and consistency is what most drivers actually need most of the time. Michelin, does the premium price buy premium performance in Australia? Michelin's pricing sits meaningfully above both Bridgestone and Kumho. Depending on the size and specification, you are paying anywhere from 20 to 40% more per tyre than you would for the equivalent Bridgestone, and in some cases, more than double what a comparable Kumho would cost. The question this comparison needed to answer honestly is whether that premium translates into performance advantages that are meaningful in Australian conditions, or whether it primarily buys European test track bragging rights that do not survive contact with the reality of driving in this country? The answer is more nuanced than either the Michelin faithful or the Michelin skeptics would prefer. In wet weather performance, genuinely the most safety-critical dimension of any tire comparison, the Michelin was measurably better than both of its competitors. Braking distances on wet surfaces were shorter. The tire's response to sudden directional changes on wet roads was more controlled and more confidence-inspiring, and in standing water conditions that were severe enough to genuinely threaten aquaplaning, the Michelin's drainage characteristics produced a notably more stable and more predictable response than either the Bridgestone or the Kumho. If wet weather performance is your primary concern, and if you live in Melbourne, Tasmania, or the wet tropics, it probably should be. The Michelin's premium is earning its price. In high-temperature conditions, the Michelin was also the strongest performer. The compound maintained its performance characteristics more consistently as temperatures rose, and the braking and handling responses remained more predictable in sustained heat than either competitor. For drivers in Queensland, the Northern Territory, or Western Australia, who are regularly operating in conditions that push tire compounds to their thermal limits, this is a meaningful advantage. Where the Michelin's premium becomes harder to justify is in the conditions that are less glamorous, but arguably more representative of how most Australians actually use their vehicles. On rough and degraded road surfaces, the performance difference between the Michelin and the Bridgestone was not significant enough to justify the price gap. On light, unsealed roads, the Michelin's road tire characteristics were not better suited to the conditions than the Bridgestone's. And in straightforward urban and suburban daily driving, the Michelin's advantages over the Bridgestone were present but subtle, detectable by attentive drivers, but not the dramatic difference that the price premium might lead you to expect. Before we get to the Kumho results, which genuinely surprised us, and the overall verdict, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We do these real-world Australian comparisons regularly, and the next one covers a product category that every Australian household spends money on, but almost nobody compares honestly. You will want to see it. Kumho, the budget tire that refused to be embarrassed. Here is where this comparison gets genuinely interesting, because the expectation going into the Kumho testing, an expectation that we held alongside every assumption we were trying to test, was that the budget tire would perform like a budget tire. Adequately in easy conditions, meaningfully worse in demanding ones, and overall in a way that validated the conventional wisdom that you get what you pay for in tires, and that skimping on rubber is a false economy. The Kumho Extra and Solus ranges, the specific products we tested in the relevant size ranges, did not read that script. In urban and suburban daily driving, the Kumho was genuinely competitive with the Bridgestone. Ride comfort was comparable. Road noise, which is often the area where budget tires reveal themselves most clearly, was higher than both the Bridgestone and Michelin, but not by the dramatic margin that the price difference might predict. The gap was noticeable on smooth motorway surfaces at sustained speed, less apparent in the stop-start urban driving that dominates most Australian daily commutes. Wet weather performance was where we expected the Kumho to fall furthest short of its more expensive competitors, and wet weather performance was where the gap was most pronounced. Braking distances on wet surfaces were longer than both the Bridgestone and the Michelin, not alarmingly so, but consistently and measurably so across multiple test runs in multiple conditions. In standing water, the Kumho's aquaplaning threshold was lower than both competitors. These are genuine safety considerations, and they are the honest reason why we cannot simply recommend the Kumho as the obvious choice on price grounds alone. In high-temperature conditions, the Kumho performed better than we anticipated, maintaining reasonably consistent characteristics across the temperature range we tested. It was not as stable as the Michelin at extreme temperatures, but it was closer to the Bridgestone than the price difference would predict. On rough road surfaces, the Kumho was actually competitive. Its sidewall characteristics absorbed surface irregularities in a way that compared well with the Bridgestone and did not embarrass itself against the Michelin. The Kumho picture is one of a tire that offers genuinely impressive value for money in conditions that represent the majority of Australian driving, with real and measurable limitations in the specific conditions, wet weather, extreme heat, where tire performance matters most for safety. Whether those limitations are acceptable depends entirely on where you drive and in what conditions. The verdict, and it is more complicated than a single winner. Here is the honest conclusion that this comparison produced, and it is not the clean single-sentence verdict that makes for a satisfying headline, even though the headline of this video promised one. If you drive primarily in wet conditions, Melbourne, Tasmania, anywhere in the wet tropics, and particularly if you do significant highway driving where the consequences of a wet weather incident are most severe, the Michelin is worth the premium. The wet weather performance advantage is real, it is measurable, and in the conditions where it matters most, it is the kind of difference that justifies paying more. If you are a typical Australian driver, doing a mix of urban commuting, occasional highway driving, and some rural road use in predominantly dry conditions, the Bridgestone is the right answer. It is not the most exciting product in this comparison, but it is the most consistently capable across the full range of conditions that most Australian drivers encounter. It is backed by the best service and availability network in the country, and its pricing is reasonable for the quality it delivers. If your budget is genuinely constrained and you are choosing between Kumho tires and driving on tires that are beyond their safe service life because replacement is unaffordable, choose the Kumho without hesitation. A fresh Kumho is meaningfully safer than a worn Bridgestone or Michelin, and the Kumho's real-world performance in dry and mixed conditions is genuinely respectable. Just be aware of its wet weather limitations and adjust your driving behavior accordingly. The clear winner this comparison was looking for turns out to be the answer that actually serves Australian drivers, rather than the answer that makes the cleanest video title. And the answer is this: the best tire is the one that matches your specific driving conditions, your specific budget, and your honest assessment of where and how you drive. The worst tire is the one you chose without thinking about any of those things. Which brings us back to where we started. 4 contact patches, the size of a human hand. Everything else follows from what you put there. If this kind of honest, real-world Australian product comparison is what you have been looking for, the kind that tells you what actually matters rather than what the marketing budgets want you to hear, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We do this regularly. Share it with anyone you know who is due for new tires, which, given Australian tire replacement rates, is probably most people you know.